Picture this. You're a servant in a medieval palace, and the king summons you to his private chambers. Your heart pounds as you approach the throne, but instead of receiving orders or punishment, the monarch does something that makes your blood run cold. He extends his foot toward you and commands you to lick it clean. This isn't fiction. This actually happened in royal courts across history. What drives a human being to demand such degrading acts from their subjects? Today, we're diving deep into the twisted world of royal humiliation rituals that took place behind palace walls. These aren't just stories about power-hungry monarchs. They're windows into the darkest aspects of absolute authority, and what happens when one person holds the power of life and death over thousands. The practice of foot-licking wasn't isolated to one crazy king or one particular era. It spans continents and centuries, from the Byzantine Empire to medieval Europe, from ancient Persia to imperial China. But why feet? What psychological warfare was at play here? And how did entire civilizations normalize such degrading practices? Let me tell you about Emperor Caligula of Rome, who didn't just demand foot worship. He made it an art form. Historical accounts from Suetonius describe how Caligula would force senators, the most powerful men in the empire, to crawl on their bellies and kiss his feet during public ceremonies. But here's the truly disturbing part. He'd often wear his sister's shoes during these rituals, adding layers of humiliation that went beyond simple dominance. Caligula understood something that modern psychologists have only recently begun to study. Humiliation creates a unique form of psychological control that goes far deeper than fear or physical punishment. When you force someone to perform a degrading act, especially in front of others, you don't just control their body, you rewire their brain. The shame becomes part of their identity, making rebellion almost psychologically impossible. But Caligula was just getting started. He'd invite foreign dignitaries to Rome, and during supposedly diplomatic meetings, would suddenly demand they remove his sandals with their teeth. Imagine being an ambassador from a powerful kingdom, arriving with gifts and treaties, only to find yourself on your knees with a leather strap in your mouth. The political implications were devastating. These ambassadors returned home having been symbolically conquered before any battle was fought. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian II took things even further. After being overthrown and having his nose cut off, yes, that actually happened, he eventually regained power in 705 AD. His revenge was legendary and brutal. He didn't just execute his enemies, he created elaborate humiliation ceremonies that lasted for days. Court records describe how he would force former conspirators to lick honey from between his toes while their families watched. The honey, historians believe, was deliberately mixed with wine to make the taste even more revolting. What's fascinating is that these weren't just random acts of sadism. They were carefully calculated political tools. In the medieval mind, the foot was considered the most base part of the body, literally the lowest point of a human being. By forcing submission to their feet, these rulers were creating a hierarchy that went beyond social class or military rank. They were establishing themselves as fundamentally different species of human. The Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, understood this psychology perfectly. When he conquered Milan in 1162, he didn't just burn the city, he created a humiliation ritual that lasted for generations in local memory. The city's leaders were forced to remove a fig from the rear end of a donkey, using only their teeth, then place the same fig at the emperor's feet and lick his boots clean. This wasn't just punishment. It was psychological warfare designed to break the spirit of an entire population. But here's what's really disturbing. These practices weren't considered unusual for their time. They were documented matter-of-factly by court historians, the same way we might document a state dinner or diplomatic meeting today. The normalization of such extreme degradation tells us something profound about how power functioned in these societies. In the court of Louis XIV at Versailles, foot rituals took on a different character, but were no less psychologically devastating. The Sun King didn't typically demand foot licking, but he created elaborate ceremonies around his morning dressing routine, where nobles would compete for the honor of putting on his stockings or shoes. What seems like privilege was actually a sophisticated form of humiliation. Grown men fighting for the right to touch the king's feet. The question that haunts historians is simple. How did we get here? How did human societies evolve to the point where forcing another human to lick your feet seemed not just acceptable, but necessary for maintaining order? The answer lies in understanding power not as a political concept, but as a psychological weapon that can reshape the human mind in ways we're only beginning to understand. Now let's dig deeper into the psychology behind these foot rituals. Because what we're really looking at here is one of the most sophisticated forms of mind control ever developed. Modern neuroscience has revealed something that ancient kings understood instinctively. Humiliation doesn't just hurt in the moment. It literally rewires the brain's neural pathways. Dr. John Gottman's research on power dynamics shows that when someone is forced to perform a degrading act, their brain releases a cocktail of stress hormones that actually changes how they perceive themselves and their relationship to authority. The victim does not just remember being humiliated, they internalize the idea that they deserve to be humiliated. This is exactly what these medieval kings were achieving through foot worship rituals. Take the case of Ivan the Terrible of Russia, who perfected what historians call graduated humiliation. He didn't just demand that servants lick his feet, he created an entire hierarchy of foot-related degradation. New servants started by washing his feet with warm water and expensive soaps. Those who showed insufficient enthusiasm were demoted to licking his feet clean. But the worst punishment was reserved for those who had truly displeased him. They were forced to lick the mud from his boots after he'd walked through the palace gardens. What Ivan understood, probably without realizing it, was that he was creating what psychologists now call learned helplessness. Each level of degradation made resistance seem more futile. If you could force yourself to wash the king's feet, maybe licking them wasn't so much worse. If you'd already licked clean feet, how much more degrading could dirty boots be? It was a psychological trap that caught even the strongest-willed individuals. The court records from Ivan's reign reveal something even more disturbing. Servants began competing for the privilege of performing these acts. They would actually fight amongst themselves for the opportunity to degrade themselves before the Tsar. This wasn't Stockholm Syndrome. This was something much more sophisticated. Ivan had created a system where voluntary self-humiliation became a path to survival and even advancement within the court hierarchy. Emperor Nero took the psychological manipulation even further with what he called divine foot ceremonies. He claimed that his feet held healing properties, and that licking them was actually a privilege that would bring good fortune. Court physicians were forced to write medical treatises supporting these claims. Nobles who had initially resisted the practice began volunteering for it, convincing themselves they were receiving some kind of benefit. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of these practices: the role of witnesses. These humiliation rituals almost never happened in private. They were performed in front of audiences, often including the victim's family members, colleagues, and rivals. The public nature wasn't accidental, it was the entire point. Modern trauma research has shown that public humiliation creates what's called social death. The victim doesn't just feel ashamed. They believe that everyone who witnessed the event now sees them as fundamentally less human. This perception often becomes permanent, affecting every future interaction they have with those witnesses. The kings who designed these rituals understood that they were destroying not just individuals, but entire social networks. King Henry VIII of England, despite his reputation, was actually relatively restrained in his foot rituals compared to his continental counterparts. However, court records show that he did force Thomas More, his former friend and Lord Chancellor, to kiss his feet before ordering his execution. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about ensuring that history would remember. More not as a principled martyr, but as someone who had ultimately submitted to royal authority. The Spanish Inquisition took foot humiliation to industrial levels. During the auto da fe ceremonies, condemned heretics were forced to crawl on their bellies and lick the feet of church officials before being burned at the stake. But here's the twist that shows the sophisticated psychology at work. Many of these victims were offered the chance to avoid the foot licking if they would confess to additional crimes they hadn't committed. Most chose the foot licking, thinking it was the lesser humiliation. They didn't realize that the choice itself was part of the psychological breakdown process. Perhaps the most revealing case study comes from the court of Emperor Akbar in Mughal India. Akbar created what he called foot meditation sessions, where courtiers were required to stare at his feet for hours while reciting prayers. Those who showed signs of boredom or distraction were forced to lick the feet they had failed to properly worship. Over time, many courtiers reported that they genuinely began to find the emperor's feet beautiful and worthy of devotion. This wasn't just political theater. This was systematic brainwashing using techniques that wouldn't look out of place in a modern cult. The repetitive nature of the ritual, the social pressure from other participants, the gradual escalation of commitment, these are all hallmarks of what psychologists now recognize as coercive persuasion. The foot, in these contexts, became a symbol that went far beyond the physical. It represented the lowest point of the ruler's body, and by extension, a point lower than the highest point of the subject's body, their head, seat of reason, and dignity. The act of licking it was a complete inversion of the natural order, a deliberate destruction of human hierarchy that placed the ruler in a category beyond normal human relationships.
Let me tell you about some cases so extreme they'll make your previous examples seem almost reasonable. We're talking about rulers who turned foot humiliation into an art form of psychological torture that would make modern dictators take notes. Emperor Commodus of Rome, the inspiration for the villain in Gladiator, didn't just demand foot worship. He turned it into a gladiatorial sport.
Historical accounts from Cassius Dio describe how Commodus would force senators to fight each other for the privilege of licking his feet. The winner got to perform the act immediately, while the loser had to wait and watch, building anticipation and dread. But here's the truly sick part. Sometimes he would reverse the reward at the last second, forcing the winner to watch the loser receive what they thought was a privilege. This psychological switching technique is something we now recognize as advanced torture methodology. By constantly changing the rules and rewards, Commodus created a state of learned helplessness, where his victims could never predict what would please or anger him. They became completely dependent on his whims, unable to develop any strategy for survival beyond total submission. But Commodus had another trick that reveals the depth of his psychological manipulation. He would force mothers to watch their sons perform foot worship, or husbands to watch their wives. The sexual undertones weren't accidental. Roman society had strict concepts of honor and dignity tied to gender roles. By forcing these intimate humiliations in front of family members, Commodus wasn't just breaking individuals, he was destroying entire family structures. Moving east, Emperor Yang of Sui in ancient China created what historians call the Lotus Foot Festival. This wasn't about the bound feet of women. This was about his own feet, which he claimed were perfect lotus blossoms that deserved worship. Court records describe ceremonies where hundreds of courtiers would spend entire days crawling around the throne room, taking turns to lick different parts of his feet while reciting poetry about their beauty and divine nature. What makes Yang's case particularly disturbing is the elaborate theological justification he created. He commissioned scholars to write texts proving that his feet were manifestations of Buddhist enlightenment and that licking them was a path to spiritual advancement. Over time, many courtiers genuinely began to believe this propaganda. They would compete not just for access to the emperor's feet, but for the spiritual benefits they believed the act provided. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian II, whom we mentioned earlier, created what might be the most psychologically sophisticated humiliation ritual in recorded history. After regaining his throne, he didn't just punish his enemies, he created the ceremony of returning grace. Former conspirators were told they could earn forgiveness through a ritual that would demonstrate their renewed loyalty. The ceremony involved 3 stages. First, washing the emperor's feet with their tears. Second, drying them with their hair. And finally, kissing each toe, while reciting their crimes and asking for forgiveness. The genius of this system was that it appeared voluntary. No one was technically forced to participate, they could choose death instead. But Justinian made sure that families of conspirators were also invited to witness the ceremony. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Perform this degrading act in front of your children and wife, or condemn them to poverty and persecution by choosing death. Court records show that some participants actually thanked Justinian after completing the ceremony. They had been so broken by the experience that they genuinely felt grateful for the opportunity to humiliate themselves. This is what psychologists now recognize as trauma bonding. The victim develops positive feelings toward their abuser as a survival mechanism. King Vlad the Impaler, yes, the inspiration for Dracula, took foot humiliation in a direction that combined physical torture with psychological degradation. His innovation was the progressive foot service. Prisoners would start by washing his feet normally, but each day the water would be made slightly hotter, until by the end of a week, they were essentially boiling their hands while performing the service. Those who pulled away from the scalding water were immediately impaled, while those who continued despite the burns were rewarded with slightly cooler water the next day.
This created a horrific psychological dynamic where victims were constantly calculating pain versus hope. The foot washing became secondary to the mental torture of never knowing whether today would be the day the water was too hot to endure. Many prisoners reported that they began to prefer the impaling to the psychological uncertainty.
Perhaps the most documented extreme case comes from the court of Emperor Caligula, who created foot hunting expeditions. He would have servants released into the palace gardens like wild animals, then hunt them down with dogs. Those who were caught were given a choice: lick his feet for an hour while the dogs watched, or be fed to the dogs immediately.
But Caligula had rigged the system. The dogs were trained to attack anyone who showed fear while performing the foot worship. It was an impossible situation designed to maximize psychological torture. The Spanish king Philip II, during the height of the Inquisition, created mobile foot humiliation units that would travel throughout his territories. Local nobles suspected of insufficient loyalty would be visited by these units and forced to perform elaborate foot worship ceremonies in front of their own subjects. The psychological impact was devastating. These nobles lost all authority and respect in their communities, making rebellion impossible while simultaneously serving as examples to really twisted. These weren't just the whims of crazy kings. Entire religious and cultural systems were developed to justify and normalize foot worship rituals. What we're looking at is the systematic manipulation of human belief systems to support some of the most degrading practices in history. Let's start with the concept of divine foot doctrine that emerged in multiple civilizations independently. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs claimed that their feet touched the earth on behalf of the gods, making them sacred conduits between heaven and earth.
Temple inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses II describe how priests would purify themselves by licking the pharaoh's feet, believing this act transferred divine essence to their souls. This wasn't considered degrading. It was the highest honor a mortal could achieve. The psychological brilliance of this system was that it reframed humiliation as privilege. Instead of being forced to perform a degrading act, priests were being granted access to divine power. Over generations, this belief became so entrenched that priests' families would compete politically for the right to serve in foot ceremonies. They were literally fighting for the opportunity to be humiliated, while believing they were fighting for spiritual advancement.
Byzantine Christianity developed perhaps the most sophisticated theological justification for imperial foot worship. Court theologians created the doctrine of imperial theophany, which claimed that the emperor's feet were the lowest point where divine authority touched the earthly realm.
By humbling themselves before these feet, subjects weren't debasing themselves. They were practicing the ultimate form of Christian humility that Christ himself had demonstrated when he washed his disciples' feet. This theological twist was genius because it used Christianity's own emphasis on humility to justify imperial humiliation rituals.
Bishops wrote extensive treatises explaining how foot worship was actually a form of prayer, and that resistance to it was a form of pride, the deadliest of sins. They even created feast days celebrating famous instances of imperial foot worship, turning historical humiliations into religious holidays. The Islamic world had its own variations, particularly in the Ottoman Empire.
The concept of sultan's sacred steps developed around the idea that the sultan's feet carried the weight of governing all Muslims, making them instruments of Allah's will on earth. Court scholars wrote elaborate commentaries on how licking the sultan's feet was a form of submission to divine authority, not human degradation. What makes the Ottoman system particularly interesting is how it incorporated Sufi mysticism. Foot worship ceremonies were performed to rhythmic chanting and sometimes involved whirling dances around the sultan's throne. Participants would work themselves into religious ecstasies while performing degrading acts, creating a psychological state where humiliation and spiritual transcendence became indistinguishable. Hindu kingdoms in medieval India developed the concept of pada puja, foot worship, but applied it to human rulers rather than just gods. The theological justification was that kings were avatars of Vishnu, and their feet were therefore worthy of the same worship traditionally reserved for divine statues. Court Brahmins created elaborate rituals around royal foot worship, including specific mantras that had to be chanted while licking the king's toes. The genius of the Hindu system was its integration with existing religious practices. People were already comfortable with foot worship in religious context, so extending it to political contexts felt natural rather than revolutionary. The same priests who led foot worship ceremonies in temples would lead identical ceremonies in throne rooms, creating seamless continuity between religious and political submission. European Christianity initially resisted imperial foot worship until it didn't. The Carolingian Empire developed the doctrine of Christus Domini, which claimed that Christian kings ruled directly as Christ's representatives on earth. Since Christ had washed his disciples' feet, it was appropriate for subjects to wash, and eventually lick, their king's feet as a demonstration of Christian obedience. The Holy Roman Empire took this further with the concept of imperial passion, which compared the emperor's suffering and governance to Christ's suffering on the cross. Just as Mary Magdalene had washed Christ's feet with her tears and dried them with her hair, so subjects should show similar devotion to their earthly representative of divine authority.
Perhaps the most sophisticated justification came from Confucian scholars in imperial China, who developed the concept of hierarchical harmony. They argued that society functioned like a human body, with the emperor as the head and subjects as various organs. The feet, being the foundation that supported the entire body, deserved special reverence from all other parts. Licking the emperor's feet was therefore not degradation, but recognition of natural cosmic order. Chinese court philosophers created detailed treatises on the metaphysical significance of foot worship, comparing it to the way rivers flowed toward the sea, or the way all plants turn toward the sun. They made it seem not just natural, but inevitable, a physical expression of the fundamental forces that govern the universe. The most disturbing aspect of these justifications is how effective they were. Archaeological evidence shows that these practices continued for centuries, often surviving multiple dynasties and regime changes. People didn't just tolerate these rituals, they internalized them so completely that they felt genuine religious or philosophical conviction while performing them. Modern psychological research has shown how powerful religious and cultural framing can be in reshaping perception. When degrading acts are presented as sacred duties or natural expressions of cosmic order, the human mind can adapt to accept almost anything as normal and even desirable.
You might think these barbaric practices died out with medieval kingdoms, but the psychological mechanisms that made them possible are still operating in our world today. Understanding how entire civilizations normalized foot worship rituals gives us crucial insights into modern power structures and manipulation techniques that are being used right now. Let's start with the most obvious parallel: corporate culture. While CEOs aren't literally demanding foot worship, many companies have created ritualized humiliation practices that serve the same psychological function. Think about team building exercises, where employees are forced to perform embarrassing tasks in front of colleagues, or performance reviews that require workers to publicly confess their failures and express gratitude for the opportunity to improve. Silicon Valley tech companies have perfected what could be called gamified humiliation. Employees compete in public rankings, share personal failures at mandatory vulnerability sessions, and participate in corporate retreats that involve deliberately embarrassing activities. The psychological principle is identical to medieval foot worship. Create situations where people voluntarily participate in their own degradation while believing it's for their benefit. The most chilling modern parallel might be found in certain political movements and cults. The next IVM sex cult, exposed in recent years, used graduated humiliation techniques that would have impressed Byzantine emperors. Members started with small compromises of dignity, sharing embarrassing personal stories or performing minor degrading acts, before progressing to more extreme humiliation rituals. The foot worship of medieval courts has evolved into modern collateral systems where people provide increasingly compromising material about themselves to prove loyalty. Social media has created the first mass-scale voluntary humiliation system in human history. Millions of people now regularly share embarrassing personal information, perform for the approval of strangers, and compete in degrading challenges for viral attention. The psychological reward systems that once made courtiers compete to lick royal feet now make teenagers compete to go viral with increasingly extreme content. The cancel culture phenomenon also echoes historical humiliation rituals. Public figures who fall from grace are expected to perform elaborate apology ceremonies that often involve admitting to crimes they did not commit, expressing gratitude to those who destroyed their careers, and demonstrating their unworthiness through self-degradation.
Those who refuse to participate in these rituals are often completely ostracized, while those who perform them convincingly may be allowed back into society. Educational institutions have their own versions of ritualized humiliation.
Hazing in fraternities, sororities, and sports teams follows the exact same psychological principles as imperial foot worship. Create artificial scarcity around group membership, force applicants to perform degrading acts to prove their worthiness, and ensure the humiliation happens in front of witnesses who will forever remember the victim as moment of submission. The military has institutionalized many of these techniques in basic training, but with an important difference. The humiliation is temporary and serves a specific functional purpose of breaking down individual identity to build group cohesion. The most effective military training programs carefully balance humiliation with eventual restoration of dignity and purpose.
Perhaps most disturbing are the parallels in modern therapeutic and self-help movements. Some programs use public confession and ritualized humiliation as supposed paths to personal growth. Participants pay thousands of dollars for the privilege of being screamed at, humiliated in front of groups, and forced to perform degrading acts that are framed as breakthrough moments of personal development.
The internet has also created new opportunities for voluntary foot worship through various fetish communities. But what's interesting from a historical perspective is how these communities have developed elaborate philosophical and spiritual justifications for their practices, just like medieval courts did.
Modern foot worship enthusiasts often describe their activities in terms of spiritual transcendence, power exchange as cosmic order, and humiliation as a path to enlightenment. Corporate whistleblowing situations often mirror the psychological dynamics of imperial foot worship. Employees who want to report wrongdoing are often forced through humiliating processes designed to break their will and make them abandon their complaints.
They're required to confess their own minor infractions, submit to degrading questioning, and perform elaborate demonstrations of loyalty to the organization they're trying to reform. The lesson is not that these modern practices are as extreme as medieval foot worship. Most aren't. The lesson is that the psychological mechanisms that made foot worship possible are hardwired into human nature and can be activated in any society under the right conditions. The same drives for belonging, status, and survival that made medieval courtiers compete to lick royal feet can make modern people participate in their own degradation through social media, corporate culture, or political movements. Understanding this history gives us tools to recognize manipulation when we see it. When someone demands you perform acts that feel degrading, but frames them as privileges, opportunities, or spiritual growth, you're seeing the same psychological playbook that medieval kings used.
When organizations create artificial scarcity around dignity and respect, making you compete for basic human treatment, they're using techniques perfected in imperial courts. The kings who forced servants to lick their feet understood something profound about human psychology. Given the right framework and social pressure, people will voluntarily participate in their own humiliation and even feel grateful for the opportunity. That knowledge didn't die with medieval kingdoms. It evolved, adapted, and continues to shape power relationships in our modern world. The question isn't whether these techniques will be used. They're being used right now, all around us.
The question is whether we'll recognize them when we see them and whether we'll have the courage to refuse to participate in our own degradation, even when it's dressed up as opportunity, belonging, or personal growth.